I think that's the kind of work that could happen starting now at sort of kitchen tables and dining room tables across the country. Doesn't require legislation, doesn't require bills, and thank God, because Congress can't do anything anyway. So let parents sort of destigmatize it for themselves and augur these conversations, and let that be sort of the first building block for a generation of people who can gamble more safely.
This is Conversation Balloons, a podcast of interviews with experts and friends about all things generational. I'm your host, Leah Farish. The National Council of Problem Gambling reports that 60 to 80% of high school students gambled at least once in 2023. Among college students, it was 70%. We have today Jonathan D. Cohen to talk with us about the new developments in gambling and the effect on young people. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey, thanks. With some nice juicy stats, right? Just to get us started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're a senior program officer at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Your PhD is in history from UVA. And Jonathan is the author of Losing Big, America's Reckless Bet on Sports Gambling, and the author of For a Dollar and a Dream, State Lotteries, a book about state lotteries. And he's something of an expert on Bruce Springsteen, but we'll have to let that one slide by.
Maybe for next time.
Yeah. You're going to want to hear every word that he says on this. And I also want to refer our listeners to the episode I did called Unfriendly Wager with Les Bernal of Stop Predatory Gambling a couple of years ago. And things have only gotten more dramatically bad, especially for our young people. I've heard you say, Jonathan, that the gambling addiction and losses are a public health crisis, especially for young men. Tell us how so.
Okay, so right off the bat, there's sort of a lot to unpack even, and I think you already alluded to some really telling statistics, and I think sort of the evidence that we're at, let's call it a crisis point, is evident in the data, in that 50% of men between the ages of 18 through 49 have a sports betting account, and unless you thought that this was all well and good and that gambling is fun and more people should be able to gamble, studies show that the arrival of online sports betting in a state is tied to a 25 to 30% increase in bankruptcies, a reduction in savings and investments in low-income households. The data is not there yet, especially on a state-by-state level on problem gambling, on addiction, but indications are from the states that we do have it, that rates of, even if not problem gambling, let's call it hazardous, at-risk, dangerous gambling, is on the rise. So to me, it's happening to so many different people in so many different places from so many walks of life that I'm not willing to sort of ascribe it to individual responsibility and to individual fault. I see it as a matter of public health because of the number of people who are affected.
Right. And especially, you mentioned, especially among young men. So why are young men especially vulnerable to gambling addiction and the blandishments of the industry?
Yeah. So, there's a couple non-mutually exclusive overlapping theories here, most of which I have sort of rooted in the conversations that I've had with young men in for research for the book. The first is young men are, and I'll speak for I'm not young anymore, but I'll speak for myself, are not exactly known for being sort of judicious and careful with money. And this is actually a not just exclusive to the US. This is something that Richard Reeves has observed sort of across the globe, where young men are just risk prone, generally speaking, especially when it comes to money. So, that's one thing. Secondly, and this one definitely was applicable to me about 10, 15 years ago, is a sense of overconfidence from young men, especially when it comes to sports. And this desire to prove that they know sports better than their friends, better than talk show radio hosts, or whatever the case may be. I'll just caveat here that the sports books advertising sort of oftentimes challenges young men to be better. And there's a FanDuel commercial, "Never waste a hunch," because they're sort of trying to inculcate this sense that you can beat FanDuel, which of course you can't. And then there's this third sense that you may be familiar with the work of Kyla Scanlon on sort of the financial status of Gen Z,
Yeah.
and her term for it is financial nihilism, of young men or young people in general who may have $10,000 in their pocket. They may have some savings, but in today's economy, that's not nearly enough to even give them hope for the future, to buy a house, to pay off a student loan, to start a business, whatever the case may be. So you might as well gamble, is sort of the theory, whether it's on sports or whether it's on something else. But again, these young men who are already embracing risk, whose prefrontal cortices are not developed, and so don't have sort of behavioral inhibitions like the rest of us do, and they have no sense. They don't feel like the amount of money they have is going to do them any good, so they might as well gamble with it and try to 10x it, 100x it overnight.
Mm-hmm. And I read that, I think it was in your book, that the dopamine hit that problem gamblers get is not from winning, which is what a non-addict gets, but it's from the uncertainty. It's the suspense that of the action, as they say,
Right.
that is their reward, and therefore, winning or losing, they can go back to the dopamine well for that uncertainty all the time.
Yeah, if you think about the old image of a problem gambler would be like a little old lady at a slot machine, and what someone is getting from a slot machine is the experience, the sort of liminal state, the sort of interstitial moment when the wheels are spinning. That's sort of the high. In the lottery industry, you call it a heart stopper, sort of when you're scratching a ticket and you think you've won, and you sort of feel that briefly in your bones. That's sort of the feeling that they want to inculcate among sports gamblers, or that's, to your point, where problem gamblers sort of, that's where the problem is that they're sort of addicted to this feeling, and that they need it to, sort of like the way that someone can be addicted to drugs, and you're not getting high anymore for the feeling of getting high. You're getting high to assuage the sort of dope sickness, or to sort of reduce the withdrawal symptoms. And someone who's addicted to gambling would chase dopamine, again, not because they love gambling, not because they love winning, but because they need, the term for it is action. They just need action wherever they can find it, which is how they end up betting on slots or on these crazy sports bets that we can talk about that are available in the middle of the night here in the US.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that developed partly because of the Murphy decision that gave the states the prerogative to legalize sports betting and online gambling. It was what it was about, right?
That's right. So this is, I'll try to spare folks who aren't lawyers sort of the legalistic background, but basically in 2018, on the basis of states' rights under the 10th Amendment, the Supreme Court allowed states to decide for themselves whether they want to legalize sports gambling. And then, to your point, 7 have gone further, and including Connecticut, where I live, and have legalized online casino games as well. But that's sort of when the floodgates open, and when sort of the intentional focus of onto sports betting arrived, courtesy of the Supreme Court.
I just want to give a shout out to John Warren Kent, who gave me a copy of this Illinois Law Review that came out in 2021, very critical of the Murphy decision, and it's packed with really good information, legal information about the complexities of legislation and states' rights, and the behavior of these companies. If anybody wants to look at the law, that's a good issue to start with. And he contributed to it at great cost to himself. I'll just say that.
I'm impressed. I'm impressed that your readers will go out and read a law review article. So
Well,
that's
I
great.
do. I'm a lawyer, and so I think maybe I have a few among the listeners. But let's talk about some of the things that the states are doing now that make. What are the new features of gambling that if people haven't been tracking with this industry, they may not be aware of?
Yeah. Okay. So, and this is actually a key point, is that when the Murphy decision came down in 2018, and of course it's a Supreme Court decision, which means that it actually started about 10 years earlier, when New Jersey tried to sort of legalize sports gambling. As I've said before, this is all Chris Christie's fault, and I sort of mean it. And I have this sense that if you had injected Chris Christie with truth serum around 2010, 2011, when sort of New Jersey began the campaign that ultimately led to the Supreme Court decision, he would have said, yeah, I think this is going to lead to sort of brick and mortar casinos, people going to Atlantic City in the way that they go to Las Vegas and gamble on sports there. At the time that the smartphones were only 3 or 4 years old, the internet gambling had sort of been available sort of offshore legally for many years, but not in a way that sort of was publicly accessible and looked sleek and nice and fun for sort of the average consumer. And they sort of stumbled into this environment that their states did, where unwittingly, not realizing, sort of maybe the Supreme Court not realizing what was happening underneath, was that when we got legal sports gambling, when states went in on sports gambling, they were not just going to be legalizing, a smoke-filled room in the back of a casino where you can bet $50 on the Giants. They were legalizing a modern, frictionless app where you can gamble multiple mortgage payments in a matter of seconds on Malaysian women's doubles badminton. So that is sort of the prerogative of the companies and sort of what they've wanted and the sports gambling setup that they have pursued. But that answer alone, I think, or that example alone, I think offers an explanation, I hope, of what has changed about sports gambling, is that you can gamble on, again, these obscure sports that happen on the other side of the world. You can have it on the speed of the next baseball pitch, the whether the outcome of the next tennis serve, who's going to score the first points in a basketball game, and so on. All for this feeling, for the slot machine effect that we were talking about already, for this feeling of dopamine, this feeling in the way that a social media app will offer an endless scroll of short form videos or content to look at. The sportsbook app offers the same thing. There's an endless menu of things to bet on, because it's not enough to just bet on the Giants game, watch the Giants game, and then 3 hours later place another bet. They want you to bet on every play, on every quarter, and so
on. And also, it seems to me that it's different from casinos and certainly bookies, who you could get into a credit relationship with them that then they come and break your legs if you have bet more than you had.
Not my legs, but yes, somebody else's. Yes.
One's legs. Yes. And now you have this credit card and you can run up the credit bill, and then your problem is with your credit card company, not with the gaming industry, right? There's no risk to them anymore for this credit problem that they had.
Yeah. So, and I'll just be clear, in the difference, as you've already alluded to, between a bookie and a legal sportsbook operation is you cannot gamble on FanDuel, on DraftKings, on credit. You can't gamble with a legal license operator on credit. You can, as you alluded to, in many states, gamble with a credit card, which will, of course, result in usurious interest rates and ruinous financial health and so on. Yeah. But in the way that you could end up owing your bookie $100,000, you cannot owe FanDuel $100,000 or something that, right. But you can, of course, and owe Visa or whoever else that amount of money because of your gambling.
And another feature of the technological aspect of this is that because you can bet on minuscule aspects of a game, a play, you're not just betting on who's going to win and who's going to lose, in which you might have to wait 2 or 3 hours to find that out. You get your result within 5 seconds after the tennis serve has been clocked. Then if you won or lost, and so the feedback loop has gotten very, very short and almost instantaneous. And also the algorithms that I think I saw in your book, pricing and offers vary with the customer.
They can that to the degree that I'm not sure about just the last point, only because of competition. They know that I'm a big Celtics fan. They're going to offer me a terrible odds on the Celtics, but then they know that I'll just run over to a competition where I can get better odds on the Celtics. So, but all this might be in our future, or in a state like Washington, or in a state like Oregon, or in Washington, D.C. that only have a single legal licensed sportsbook operator. Theoretically, there's no reason why they couldn't do that. And they know that you love betting on Oklahoma college football or whatever, and then they're going to juice the line on Oklahoma college football because you love your favorite team and you want to bet on your favorite team. But maybe more to the point, and again, this is anecdotal evidence. I haven't seen sort of direct of this. The kind of things that casinos of the 1950s wish they could have done. Figuring out when your paycheck arrives and emailing you promotional offers, 10 minutes before or 10 minutes after, figuring out when you haven't opened the app in a couple of days, a couple of hours, a couple of weeks, whatever, and sending you sort of just the right promotional nudge with just the right team or just the right parlay in their email that looks a little too easy, because of course it is. And again, just taking advantage of all the data that all these other companies, social media companies, search, Google, and so on already have on us, but leveraging it not for the purposes of just data mining you and to sell you ads, but in this case to get you to gamble more.
Yeah. And they have, again, it's a snowballing virtuous cycle for them. The more this grows, the more data they have. The predator knows the prey better than the prey does. They know your behavior really better than you do, because I really think problem gamblers have a big problem with self-awareness and reality, connection to reality, whereas these algorithms have no problem with that.
I'll do you one better. It's not only problem gamblers who have a bad sense of self-awareness. It's young people, young men. It's actually all gamblers. If you look at surveys asking people like, do you think you make or lose money gambling on sports? It's invariably like 70 to 90% of people think they're making money gambling on sports, when I don't know, something's keeping the lights on in Vegas. So it's not 70 to 90% of people making money. And so people just have this delusional sense of how good they are specifically at gambling. That's sort of unique to gambling, that you're right. So pile that onto another reason why these young men are running into trouble, or pile that into that overconfidence bucket. And then lo and behold, pair that with these data companies and their sort of precise operations, and sort of a noxious cocktail, or a cocktail made for disaster.
Yeah, it's human nature. I don't mean to trample problem gamblers, because we all have it. I had a nearby person in our community who was a mortgage banker, and he came upstairs to his wife, who was already in bed, and said, "I've lost everything." And she said, "What do you mean you've lost everything?" He said, "No, I've lost all our money." And she didn't even know he was gambling online, and he had looted everything they had, and they had a for sale sign out in front of their house. And I told the wife, when she told me, your husband's at great risk for suicide at this point. I hope that you really get him help and are able to stand with him through this, because that's what happens next. A lot of times we're talking about a life and death struggle. And I was reading that Gamblers Anonymous is seeing 18-year-olds come in to meetings. They've never seen that before. We're seeing 19, 20-year-olds having to declare bankruptcy, and that means they can't apply for a mortgage for 7 years. Their credit is ruined at a crucial building time in their lives. It's a huge setback for starting a family and finding a home and having, possibly credibility in the workplace. You talk about in the book that one of the people you said, I thought it was poignant, young man said, at the end of the day, you lose your cash, you lose your time. At the end of the day, you lose. And it isn't just money, it's time, it's the focus, and
it's the brain, your dopamine cycles in your brain. You can't really another problem gambler who I profile in the book. His sleep he hasn't gambled in now I think 3 years, and he still really can't sleep, or can't sleep well, because his brain was just so hardwired for gambling, and it's how he would fall asleep at night, and how he would wake up in the morning. And that other problem gambler, his name is Kyle, who you quoted from, what he describes it as a landmine in front of young men. No, not everyone's going to step on it, but it's just sort of this other thing that's strewn out there on the beach, and you might step on it, and lo and behold, at 18 years old, your sort of life is going to be disrupted or destroyed. And yeah, we've just sort of strewn these around and like, let's hope no one steps on them. And as you've sort of already alluded to, many people are.
And yet the industry seems to be kind of insulated from liability and has this now more than ever a symbiotic relationship with government. And I noticed there are never any riots in Las Vegas.
Well,
It's all very
there's actually,
orderly.
yeah, there's some very weird reasons for that. I don't know if you know, like all the sidewalks in Las Vegas are actually private, at least on the Las Vegas Strip, are privately managed and owned by the casino companies. So there's no sort of public
Picketing
space. There's no public space in Las Vegas. Hal Rothman wrote about this in an amazing book that I think was so prescient about sort of the neoliberal era in the late 90s, but about how Las Vegas as sort of an entertainment hub, as a hub of privatization, sort of like presages what is arriving for the rest of America. But that's for our next conversation, not the Bruce Springsteen one, but the one after.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
we're not really talking much about brick and mortar. I mean, I know that brick and mortar casinos were not appealing to young people.
Right.
And they had to find ways to get a young market interested in gambling, and they certainly have done that. Talk about the relationship of universities and NFL teams and such to online gambling.
Yeah. So the universities, this was a bit of a disaster that's since gotten better, and not to be sort of a hammer to whom everything is a nail, but this sort of it's a great representation of sort of the thesis of the book, and you read the title, and the key word in the title is reckless, and sort of just to give away the thesis a little bit, right? It's that I think online gambling is fine. It should be legal, but the way it was rolled out was not fine, and that the way it was rolled out was reckless and unnecessarily so. And this university example is a perfect one, in that in maybe 2020, 21, 22, a couple of universities, Michigan State, Louisiana State, and a few others, entered into partnerships with sports betting companies. So they would have sort of online sports betting companies would have advertising on college campuses. And at University of Colorado Boulder, there was in fact a setup where for every student who signed up using the university's official promo code, the university would get like $35 or something. So the university had like an incentive to like get its students to sign up for a sports betting company. So those partnerships have since been ended after revelations from the New York Times. The American Gaming Association now outlaws its members from engaging in those partnerships. Some states engage in those and now ban them as well. But again, this is all to my point of what was the rush of sort of getting this up so fast that we allowed these sort of partnerships? Couldn't we have sort of taken a little bit more care, done a little bit more slowly, and stopped these things before they developed, rather than sort of acting responsibly? We can get to the NFL, but that, again, the universities is, again, I think has gotten better. At least there's sort of formal structural relationships with the companies, but it's emblematic of the heedlessness with which we walked into online sports gambling.
Yeah. Well, there's not a big rich tsunami of money waiting to burst forth if you protect children.
Yes.
We've seen that with the marijuana industry. The no votes just have to kind of self-fund. There's no
social media
financial.
is another example.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about how kids under 18 are being lured into it. What are the companies doing to get kids hooked on gambling?
Yeah, so there's a couple things here. First of all, and this is another example of this sort of recklessness, is that when sports betting first became legal, so to gamble in most states you have to be 21. In some states it's 18, and you need to bet with a company like FanDuel or DraftKings or legal licensed sportsbook. They really do have some ID verification. You need to put in your social security number, maybe a picture of your driver's license, and so on. But again, as an example of this recklessness, when this was first rolling out, I've spoken to a lot of parents or kids who the dad and the son want to gamble together, and then they do it on the kid's phone. And lo and behold, the kid now has an unlimited access to a frictionless gambling app on their phone, because there was sort of no education infrastructure, no warning system in place that that's not legal or you're not supposed to do that. So if a young person, someone under the age of 18, or in most states under 21, is gambling sort of with FanDuel or DraftKings, sort of traditional sports betting, they're probably doing it thanks to their parents, whether their parents is involved directly or not. So that's not great. There are also these other companies, some of which are fully legal and licensed, some of which are sort of operating in this gray market where that will allow people, whether they're under the age of 18 or just 18 plus, to gamble. So these are things like prediction markets, which are legal across the country, which basically let you bet on sports, which are 18 plus. There are these other apps. They call themselves Daily Fantasy 2.0. They're basically just sports betting in disguise, but they have very, very weak age verification system. I think when I signed up, I told them I was born in like 1912 or something, and they still let me sign up. So I don't think there are a lot of like 113-year-olds out there who are gambling on sports. And if you talk to young people these days, high schoolers, many of them are not actually sort of gambling on sports in the traditional way. They're gambling through these apps called Underdog and Prize Picks, which are this sort of new frontier, again, quasi-legal or fully legal, but not quite sports betting. They're sort of just going through this sort of carve out for fantasy sports and daily fantasy sports. And then all this is, I haven't even brought up sort of the advertising portion, which is, the ads aren't allowed to target children, but of course are aired during games and during events where children may very well be watching. And of course, we haven't allowed that for cigarettes since 1969, but we do for sports gambling. And so here we are with your 7th inning stretch, brought to you by Caesar Sportsbook.
Yeah. and I believe Disney even has a little game that I've seen that says, pick which is your favorite athlete in the upcoming game or something. And just that is kind of starting to get them to think in terms of not just what team will win, but actually using their hunches or getting invested, so to speak.
No, this is right, and it's a great example. It's even of moving beyond sports betting traditionally of what's called sort of the gamblification. And if you look at these online games or iPad games even that young people play, like Roblox or Minecraft, there are all these gambling mechanics in there, such that as a young person, someone like literally who's like 5 years old or 8 years old might not realize they're gambling, but they're effectively like playing a slot machine. Or young people will play these things called video game skins, which you don't have to get into, but I see all the time people posting about how they basically didn't realize they were gambling, and lo and behold, they have a gambling addiction through this video game skins, and then that becomes too slow, so then they switch to the stock market, and then they go from the stock market to sports betting, and then it's just down, 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 down.
Yeah.
So yes, there are lots of ways, again, whether we sort of kid ourselves that it has to be about legal, traditional, licensed online sports bet gambling, or if it's something else that is, again, effectively offering the same thing from a dopamine perspective, even if it's disguised as something else.
Yeah, and loot boxes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I did read a Pew Research study that said that in 2025, the number of people age 20 to 25 or so who believe that gambling is bad for society is up to 43%, whereas in 2022 it was 34%. So it may be that young people are seeing, more young people are seeing that it's bad for society. There's a little bit more sanguine view of whether it's bad for sports. But that number, 43% of it, thinking it's bad for society, is as high as among 30 to 64-year-olds. So it may be that some of them are seeing their friends or experiencing these losses and difficulties. And but I do want to ask you, what can a family do when they want to know if their child is gambling, or if their teenager or their young adult is gambling? What are the signs that they're getting in over their heads?
Yeah. So this is an important question. Into your example earlier about your friend, the mortgage broker, in that gambling addiction doesn't show up physically in the way that alcohol addiction or drug addiction might. You can't sort of detect through sort of physical, signs that someone has a gambling addiction. I would say, if they're glued to their phones, but that describes probably any young person. So
Right.
good luck sort of distinguishing that from gambling addiction. But I do think there are ways, especially if you're able to monitor any of their bank accounts or financial apps, that you can basically tell if there are large deposits or frequent deposits being sent out to, whether it's a gambling company or sort of some unknown offshore website. I've looked at credit card statements from problem gamblers, and they're buying like $512 stuff from some Chinese basically money laundering front that will like let them sort of get money to a bookie or to an offshore website. So I would say that would be sort of the biggest tell, right? Is you need to get money down, and these people are probably getting money down digitally. They're not using cash, and so finding a way to track that. And then generally, I mean, I think it obviously depends on the person, but gambling addiction, because of the dopamine deficits, would present like depression, or can present like depression, or sort of other mental health crises. And I'm not going to say that everyone who is having a bad week is a gambling addict or something. But for a parent who has a child who's maybe suspiciously interested in sports, and their sports interest has seemed to significantly change recently, or they seem to be sort of living or dying on these obscure sports to which they do not have an obvious rooting interest, because it's not any of their favorite teams or anything. Again, those are all be things to look out for and to recognize that those could be. Again, I'm not going to say every single person who likes the Green Bay Packers who's not from Wisconsin has a gambling problem, but could be the signs of someone who is sort of in over their heads, or whose gambling has gotten out of control.
Yeah. What do you think are some other guardrails that could be put in place that would protect people?
Yeah. So actually, they all sort of are downstream of a single idea, which is friction, which is slowing the pace of play down and slowing down the process by which someone can sort of go from gambling casually to, getting mad, depositing more money, getting mad, depositing more money, and sort of loss chasing. And that's sort of how the spiral downward begins. So lots of things to sort of instill that friction, or impose that friction, limiting the number of times you can deposit money within a 12 or 24 hour period, making it faster to withdraw money to get it out of the app. We mentioned these sort of bets on Malaysian women's doubles badminton, or, the next point in the Czech table tennis tournament or whatever. Yeah. Just cutting those off. And those are actually really variable by state. Some states just have a much shorter catalog of betting than others. Here in Connecticut, I'm proud to say we are allowed to bet on the next point in the Czech table tennis tournament. So if you have any insight on that one for tomorrow night, let me know.
Okay.
And then other limits. I'll say I share these with a little bit of humility, because many of them have not been tried and we don't sort of have evidence yet. And the ones that we think are sort of the most obvious, you mentioned credit cards, for example. Evidence from the United Kingdom shows that it doesn't work. That reducing gambling with credit cards doesn't actually stop people who have a gambling problem from gambling with credit cards. So I offer these not because they're panaceas or they're silver bullets, or they're sort of singularly going to solve anything, but I think we need friction, and I'm sort of open to any idea, to try any idea that will get friction in. And if it doesn't work, if it's not helping the people it's not supposed to help, we shouldn't do it just because it looks good and makes us feel better. We should move on and find one that is more efficacious,
yes,
and that has a better chance of actually.
Yeah, be empirical about it.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to run by you my pet idea.
Okay.
I really, there are people who can afford to lose a lot of money, and there are people that can't even afford to lose a little money. And Blacks and Hispanics, according to this one study, gamble as much as twice as much as whites do, and often need the money more. There are people who, in my view, should have the freedom to gamble, and people who should not. And those are people who are behind on their child support, people who have outstanding judgments against them. And I think that you should have to have a gambler's license to participate. And when I was, learning about casino gambling, I was, in Oklahoma, we have tribal casinos, which make it very hard to impose laws. State law
Right.
doesn't supersede tribal law, but federal law does. But to get a federal gambler's license law would be quite an achievement. But I really do think that some people absolutely should not be allowed to waste money and take these risks when their children, their dependents, will suffer if they lose this money. And then they become wards of the state when they weren't before, or for
Yeah.
longer than they were.
No, so I mean, you're this. I haven't. This is a new one. Thank you. This is I'll say I have not thought of this, but I mean, what you're getting at, as sort of a macro question, right, is this question of individual liberty and of how much we allow people to sort of do whatever they want, even at risk of harming themselves, or more to your point about harming their children or loved ones. And studies show that someone with a gambling addiction is going to negatively affect 5 to 6, 7 other people. So are we going to allow multiple percentages of American adults to have this experience, and as a result 30%, 40% of American adults to be affected in one way by someone with a problem gambler? I don't know. Maybe if I could sort of tweak your idea a little bit, I would say, and sort of, and what your idea is sort of not dissimilar from the proposal for what's called an affordability check, where in order to gamble a certain amount, you have to prove through your income statements or bank statements or something that you can afford how much you are gambling, which again would allow someone like Phil Mickelson, who's a notorious gambler, to gamble hundreds of millions of dollars, and would stop someone like Kyle from outside of Wichita from gambling every last penny in his bank account.
Uh-huh.
And so a license is an interesting idea. Again, the thing I like the most about it is this idea of friction and this idea of having some measure of affordability. Like maybe you only need a license if you gamble more than, I never like to throw out arbitrary numbers, but like $10,000 a year or a month or whatever the number may be. It's only then that you need to sort of prove. And then how often do you have to prove it? I don't know. I know we're sort of spitballing ideas, but again, the question just becomes, to your point, how much individual autonomy are we willing to grant people when we're talking about a product that is legal and provided by or licensed by the state, but can be very, very easily ruinous for multiple generations.
Yeah, the affordability is one thing. I think, of course, you have big questions about privacy then, and
Right.
how I don't want the government or a gaming industry to know how much is in my savings. They will really, really use
They
that
would love to
data.
know. They would love to know. Yeah.
But if you use criteria that are of public record, if I am behind on my child support, if I am have declared bankruptcy, if my property is in foreclosure, this is all public record. If I'm on the
Okay.
terror watch list, all those things can be found out legitimately by anyone, and they're all things that I think should disqualify participants.
So yeah, to your point, I talked to an executive at one of the largest sports betting companies in the U.S. who talked about that they've been batting around this idea of a partnership with a credit bureau that would basically flag for them someone who seems to be gambling above their means. Now, there's of course a question here of once someone is flagged, what happens? Do they just get like a perfunctory email that says like, "Hey, you might be gambling too much," or do they have to provide a credit statement or something? So that's of course sort of where the rubber meets the road on all of these types of impositions.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not as crazy as your idea. I mean, it's not as crazy as it might have sounded. At least I thought of it when I first heard it. I was like, another license. Like people already hate driver's license. Now you have to get a license to gamble.
Yeah.
But it's actually the kind of thing, again, it's sort of in spirit at least, that gambling companies have been talking about internally.
Interesting to know. Do you have any other thoughts for us on how to protect young people, children, teens from falling down this rabbit hole? You're very gracious in saying you're not against gambling in principle, under
Or in
the right
practice.
circumstance.
I like Pittsburgh on Thursday night. Yeah.
um, but I do feel that it's just very incompatible with my ideas of what wisdom is and prudence is, and the idea of seeking to get rich quick is I think, just an unhealthy thing, and getting rich on the losing of so many other people. I really want to instill in young people the ethical problem with doing that. And but in any case, what else can we
Yeah.
do as a closing thought to
Yeah.
protect young people in their own hearts and minds from this?
Right. I think no, this is really helpful to bring up, because there is this other work that needs to happen, which let's call it sort of cultural destigmatization, which is that we sort of now we sort of societally, there's been a shift in how we talk about drug addiction, for example. And it's not your fault necessarily for getting drug addicted. We know that there are sort of certain biological and cultural and social factors that might explain your drug addiction, not to mention the fact that for many years there were a bunch of opioid companies trying to addict every person they could find on their product. So we sort of have destigmatized drug addiction, and we know to say, oh, it's not your fault. Please come forward before you run into trouble, and so on. And I think we haven't had the sort of proportional conversation about gambling, which is that the young person who you asked hypothetically, right, doesn't know to come forward, doesn't know what's happening to their brain, doesn't know to talk to their parent about it before they run into trouble, doesn't know that gambling addiction exists, right? If they know about gambling addiction, it's from like Jamie Foxx in a tuxedo at a commercial telling them how fun it is to gamble. So having those kinds of conversations in the same way that you might talk to a young person about sex or drugs or alcohol or social media in a preventative fashion, so that they know to be on the lookout for something, so that they know this sort of landmine is out there before they sort of step on it and it's worse than it needs to be because they didn't know it was coming. I think that's a kind of work that could happen starting now at sort of kitchen tables and dining room tables across the country. Doesn't require legislation, doesn't require bills, and thank God, because Congress can't do anything anyway. So let parents sort of destigmatize it for themselves and augur these conversations, and let that be sort of the first building block for a generation of people who can gamble more safely.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom on this, Jonathan. The book is Losing Big, and I recommend it because it's not just a serious, objective look at gambling, but it also has humor and humanity about it, and you've certainly conveyed that today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Subscribe and review Conversation Balloons on your favorite podcast platform. Find me at leahfarish.com and on Instagram at LeahFarish.